After striking out with Matt Rule and Frank Reich, has David Tepper finally got it right at head coach after viewing one season under Dave Canales? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, because tomorrow is Friday, and what do I do on Fridays throughout the entirety of the off season? Well, I answer your weekly Friday mailbag question. So what you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for tomorrow's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. This episode, Locked On Panthers, is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to PrizePicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Spent a lot of time talking about year one of Dan Morgan as the Carolina Panthers general manager, talked about all 9 trades that he made, talked about the drafts, selections that he made, his free agent signings, and went back and looked at all of it in totality and discussed whether the Panthers look like they have a guy who can build a winner long-term here. And I do think that Dan Morgan has all the ingredients that Carolina needs in their GM, combined with the ownership, David Tepper going away, being in the shadows and not trying to meddle, and having Brant Tillis handling the cap and contracts. And of course, the head coach, which is a big part of the success that Carolina will have or will not have moving forward with Dan Morgan as Carolina Panthers GM. So let's focus on Dave Canales for just this episode. I honestly don't have a ton of profound things to say about Dave Canales. We talked about him and we talked about the entire team all season long. There's not much more that needs to be said about the first year of Dave Canales, and I don't have a bunch of things like a series that we do with Dan Morgan. Like with Dan, didn't really spend a lot of time talking about him, and we waited till the end of the season to do that. So let's spend today's show talking about what Dave Canales got right, what he got wrong, and whether David Tepper has finally made the right head coach hire here in Carolina. Let's start off with the positive, what Dave Canales got right. I got really 2 big things I want to go over when talking about what he got right. Certainly, there was plenty of other things that he got right, but we only have like 30 minutes to talk about this, so can't really stretch it out. I know plenty of times I go like 40, 35, a lot longer than I probably should go. I'm a gas bag, my bad. Let's talk about the first thing that he really got right, and that was benching Bryce Young. At the time, as anyone who has watched this show, listened to this show with any sort of consistency through the entirety of the regular season back in 2024, you know that I hated the idea of benching Bryce Young after, week 1. And even after week 2, when it actually happened, and Dave Canales had told everybody in the media, had told you, the fan, that Bryce Young was going to be their quarterback after they had that dreadful loss at home against Los Angeles, followed up by another dreadful performance by Bryce and the offense and the entire team in that 47-10 drubbing week 1 on the road in New Orleans. He said that Bryce was going to be their quarterback, but then he slept on it, watched the film, and decided, you know what, I can't do this to this team. I cannot have Bryce Young continue to sink this ship. And even if I was brought here to work with Bryce and do for Bryce what I did for Geno back in Seattle, what I did for Baker back in Tampa, it's a team game. And there were still 15 more games, and I've got to find a way to salvage this season. And the best decision he felt like was to bench Bryce Young. He said, quote, "This is the best decision for our group, our team going forward. I just owe it to all the guys, the coaches, the staff, the players, everybody involved to be really critical about what we put on film, about what I'm seeing, and to make sure that I'm constantly making the best decision for the team every week." And it happens to be the quarterback position. It's so loaded that way, but it's every position and it's all the guys. So it's not just Bryce Young's struggles. It had to be everybody else's struggles as well. As you saw, the defense wasn't playing well. And as we know, that continued on to be a season-long trend. And, well, he made the right decision. As we look at it, hindsight being 2020, how things have played out, but he had needed to bench Bryce because the offense was just so bad and he looked so unplayable. His confidence was shaken. And I was hoping that, can he play through it? Can he make his way through it? Like you gave up so much. You brought Dave to work with him 2 weeks in, really? New offensive line, basically, bringing in some receiver talent, new running back that's going to come back eventually. You're going to bail after 2 weeks. I didn't really like it. You look at the numbers back then, Carolina's overall offensive efficiency rating was a 0.70. That through 2 games, that ranked last out of 608 instances for weeks 1 and 2 since it was first tracked back in 2006. Looking at DVOA, they had the 9th worst overall DVOA of 1,397 teams since 1979 through week 2, going all the way back, of course, to 1979. The offense is even lower, ranking as the 7th worst offense of any team through week 2 during that time span. The Panthers were dead last in pass DVOA and 31st in rush DVOA. If you cannot complete passes, you cannot stay on schedule, you cannot run the football. As we saw those first couple of weeks, they were 30th in EPA per play allowed on defense, and they were bad defensively and all of that. But offensively, it was dreadful. It was one of the worst offensive starts to an NFL season in the history of the National Football League, dating back at least till 2006 and 1979, depending on what you're looking at, whether it's efficiency rating or DVOA. They were bad. But when you look at the time that Bryce Young spent on the bench, watching Andy Dalton, Joe Person of The Athletic had a great article last week just going over Bryce's path back to being the starting quarterback and all the people behind the scenes, whether it was guys like Adam Thielen, the coaches helping him find out what it takes to be a leader in the NFL at that position. It really helped him in the final 9 games where he started, going all the way back to week 9 when he retook the starting role on the road in Denver. Bryce Young was the 6th highest graded quarterback in the NFL, behind Josh Allen, who's playing for an AFC title on Sunday, may be the MVP. Lamar Jackson, who also could be the MVP. I don't know how it's going to shake out. Joe Burrow, who will be the comeback player of the year. And I know plenty of people feel like Bryce Young should be the case. That's just the way that everything's written. It's got to be coming off of an injury and not being bad in the beginning of the year, then turning it around, which, yeah, I understand the argument there. Just the criteria, it doesn't fit for Bryce Young for what that's worth. Justin Herbert as well. He was a playoff quarterback. Baker Mayfield, playoff quarterback. So guys that were leading their teams to the playoffs. Now, I know that Baker had a costly turnover there. Herbert was awful against Houston. But those are the guys who were better than Bryce Young in the final 9 weeks when Bryce took over again as the starting quarterback for the Carolina Panthers. He was second with 25 big-time throws. The only one who was ahead of him was Joe Burrow with 26, and Burrow obviously was outstanding. So benching Bryce was the right decision for the team. That week 3 win in Las Vegas was just euphoric for everyone involved after how bad it looked. And what you saw was an NFL team. What you saw was an NFL offense. Now, the offensive passing game never quite looked like that the rest of the season for Carolina. Andy Dalton thrown for 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. Now, Bryce obviously was really good in that game against Atlanta. And excuse me, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I don't think he threw for 300 yards in a game this season either way. Like, that was one of the best offensive performances we saw from Carolina. Cincinnati was not as good, but was normal as far as, like, this is not a dreadful team that looks like they don't belong at this stage. It was a regular NFL game. The Panthers lost, but things kind of fell apart. Dalton got in that car accident, and then Bryce took over the starting role. And we saw a completely different Bryce Young really starting in that week, I guess week 9, week 10, whenever that game was against New Orleans when they won that. That was when everything really started to turn around. And after that second start in Munich, Dave Canales coming out and saying that Bryce is showing us something, and we all saw what that something was in those final 9 games, as he is going to be the quarterback again in 2025. Beyond, we'll see what happens. But in 2025, for sure, it's going to be Bryce Young's show again under center. The second thing I want to touch on briefly, I feel like Dave Canales certainly got the culture in the locker room correct. And you go back to that quote about him deciding to bench Bryce Young, saying this is the best decision for our group, our team going forward. I owe it to all the guys to make this decision and to make sure that we're putting out good stuff on film. And if Bryce Young is not doing that, not helping us win games, I can't have him out there making these guys feel like they have no chance on Sundays. And certainly the defense didn't give the team much opportunities to win. So this past season in 2024, but still he made the right decision there. And you think about guys like Deontay Johnson, who clearly didn't fit here in Carolina. They tried it out. I felt like that was a good trade to get him. It was a good trade to get rid of him, considering all the issues that were there. And you see how things have played out for him after Carolina. Obviously, hindsight's 2020. A lot of people didn't love the competition they got back, but it depends on what they're going to do with that pick swap, that 5th round pick, and who that turns out to be for the team coming up here in the NFL draft at the end of April here. But still, Deontay Johnson didn't work out. Benching Bryce, that made sense as far as the culture in the locker room, and then really making Bryce earn back that job. I didn't necessarily love all the messaging. We'll talk about that here momentarily on things that he didn't get right this past season. But as far as making him earn the job back and have the teammates really respect him in that locker room, that's the correct way as far as the culture in the locker room. And then a guy like Chuba Hubbard, who signed on, not really for any of this, but someone who they drafted and was still here. It was a final year for him, and to really be all in to perform the way that they wanted him to, and then to reward him, showing him that if you are a positive presence in this locker room and you play well on the field, we will pay you. I felt like the culture that he set in the locker room. You just look at how hard the guys played. What game can you say that they dogged it? Maybe Washington, but I don't really feel that way. I think they just got their ass kicked in all the ways that they had played as far as the end of the year. But they might have had the Dallas stinker, but they bounced back, beat Arizona. They might not have played well against Tampa, but they bounced back and they won in overtime against Atlanta. The way that team developed throughout the course of the season after that 1-7 start, finishing 4-5 to end the year, that is the culture, the foundation being laid here in Carolina by Dave Canales. So I think he definitely got that right, as you feel a lot better about where this team is going. No Jay-Z quotes. He certainly loved the energy compared to what Frank Reich gave, and that's just who Reich is. But I look at the decision to bench Bryce, the culture in the locker room, and those are certainly two things that Dave Canales got right. There's plenty of others, but we don't have all day to talk about it. We spent plenty of time this past season talking about Dave Canales, and we're not going to talk about play calling. I know how people felt about that at points of time, so I want to talk about two other things I felt like he did not get right this past season here in Carolina in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Therapy is a game changer. It can help you manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge. That's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours, and it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to match with a licensed therapist today. Go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. We talked about what Dave Canales got right in Carolina. What did he get wrong back in his first season as Panthers head coach? Two things I'm really pointing to. First one, the messaging behind benching Bryce Young. He came out and said that this was the best thing for the team. But when he was asked explicitly about Bryce on that Monday in September after benching him 2 games into the season, he didn't say when Bryce would come back, if Bryce would come back, and necessarily why Bryce was benched, other than it was what was best for the team. Didn't talk about the development plan, none of that. Just said Andy Dalton's starting quarterback. We're moving forward with Andy Dalton. And he was certainly vindicated in Las Vegas. Looked good again week 4 against Cincinnati. Looked less so good against Chicago, which is when people started asking the question, all right, okay, 3 weeks in, Andy didn't play well against Chicago. He has a brutal interception to cost him in that game against Atlanta. They played terrible on the road against Washington. When are you going to put Bryce Young back in? And one of the things, too, that happened, like that Chicago game, Panthers getting blown out. Taylor Moton gets injured in that game. Austin Corbett's lost for the season in that game. And they put in Bryce Young late into that game. And, of course, at Chicago, there's plenty of signs thanking Carolina for Caleb Williams and for Tyreek Stevenson, even though I'm pretty sure wasn't that the guy who wasn't paying attention during the Hail Mary and all of that played out a couple weeks ago. And then the Bears lost every game after that. I digress. But they were thanking Carolina for everything that they gave them with that pick and more the trade, really. So I get all that, but then Bryce Young is there playing garbage time, and Dave Canales asked about that because we had not seen Bryce Young for a couple of weeks, and there he was getting an opportunity. And Dave had this to say about it, saying, quote, "We had a couple of injuries on the offensive line and wanting to get him in there, get some live reps, and he did a fantastic job playing with energy, extending plays, finding some completions down the field, which is all fantastic. It's a hard situation." At that point, it was just like, okay, with the different things happening on the offensive line, it was something where I wanted to get Andy out of there and just give Bryce an opportunity to continue some football in there while we had time. So what that was about wasn't necessarily the development of Bryce Young, was about getting Andy out because Moton and Corbett went down. He wanted to protect Andy Dalton. And that's certainly how everybody interpreted what he had to say on that Sunday following Chicago. Then you go after the loss in Washington, the losses to Chicago, the bad interception against Atlanta, and people are asking, when is Bryce going to get back in there? And Dave Canales was asked explicitly about Bryce on that Monday following that loss against Washington. Time and time again was asked about him, and he wouldn't even mutter Bryce Young's name. He was asked on whether the organization need to see Bryce out on the field to know whether he can be a franchise quarterback. And this is what Dave Canales had to say, quote, "Right now, we're focused on the Broncos. Andy's playing this week, and that's really where our focus is at. All those other conversations are all hypothetical conversations that definitely, Dan, Brant, that we need to have. But right now, we're focused on playing the Broncos and focused on getting Andy to take another step in terms of getting us back to good football." It was about Andy Dalton. 3 times he was asked about Bryce Young and brought up Andy Dalton. Then finally, Vasti Hurts like, "Hey, you understand we're asking these questions?" Yeah, I understand. But again, we're focused on Andy Dalton. And of course, the next day, Andy Dalton gets in a car accident, picking up his kids from school. His kids, his wife, their dog, we're good, thank God. But he was going to miss that game against Denver. And then we saw how Bryce played in garbage time. Andy still wasn't ready to go. Bryce had his best game, one of his best games of his career against New Orleans in that win. And then we were going to Munich, wondering what was going to happen. Bryce can be the quarterback again. And then, after KC, after the impassioned locker room speech, the Panthers just coming up short, Dave finally said, "Yeah, Bryce is our guy." And then after the season, of course, said Bryce is our guy. So I appreciate, while I think he got it right by making Bryce earn back the job, the messaging from the very beginning and even in the middle of all of it, as far as his benching and not ever talking about what the plan was going to be, what it was. And certainly I got it wrong. I came out and he apologized about this. Like, it was 2 weeks left, and 2 weeks into the season, have 15 more games left. This was never going to be a good team. So clearly, like, Bryce getting another opportunity. It's just the way that he called the plays for Bryce, the way that he refused to even answer questions about Bryce, would always mention Andy. That didn't sit right with me. I don't think that was the best way to go about it. But of course, once Bryce got out there, he earned back the job. He played well enough, and he showed that Dave Canales made the right decision by benching him, and that he will be the guy again next year. But the messaging, I think, could have been better. And what's most important is what was the messaging within the locker room. As long as those guys know who the quarterback is and what the situation is, that's what matters. On the outside, we don't necessarily need to know, but still, you got to imagine, like, Bryce Young, his camp and all that. They probably didn't appreciate a lot of what was said, but no hard feelings. Everything's great. Everybody's happy. Kumbaya. But still didn't love the messaging there. Think he could have done a much better job with all of that, even though he made the right decision. Just do a better job of explaining it. And sure, you're probably going to say, he doesn't have to explain anything to you. It's like, okay, fine. But why have a press conference then? Being stubborn about running the ball, something we heard from Dave Canales. The first 2 things we heard, he was wanting to get the football right. And I think he did that. Talk about the culture that's been set here in Carolina. He got the football right for the most part. Like, the defense is still terrible. And that will need a lot of work this offseason, of course. But overall, they look like a operation that is not a complete joke, which is what we've become accustomed to, unfortunately, here over the last couple seasons in Carolina. He also said Dave's going to be stubborn about running the football. And we did not necessarily see that. The Panthers ranked 27th in rushing attempts per game, but they were 10th in yards per attempt. So that does not add up. How is it that you are 5th worst in the NFL as far as wanting to run the ball, but then you're top 10 in terms of every time you rush the ball, like, you have pretty much success? And Chuba Hubbard was up there all season long as far as one of the top backs in rushing success rate. Yet there's plenty of games where he did not get the ball enough. I understand earlier this season, when Bryce is terrible that they could not stay on the field. And it looked much better in Las Vegas, looked better in Cincinnati. There were other times where they could not stay on the field. I certainly understand all of that. But you go to the Tampa game, there was a time where they had 3 straight 3 and outs, which really that's where the separation came in that game, as they found themselves then in a blink of an eye down 28-7. That's the defense's fault mainly, but the offense couldn't stay on the field. They were throwing the ball. And they didn't have running backs. I get it, but damn, got to at least try. You got an offensive line. We talk about Hunt. We talk about Lewis. When breaking down the free agent signings that Dan Morgan made, those guys are really good against the run or like running the football. They're really good run blocking. Why not try it even with the backup? So I think he got that kind of wrong in play calling at times, sure. But as far as being someone running the ball, probably should have never said that, because that clearly wasn't the case this past season. With Bryce playing the way he played in the final 9 games, he can continue that and, of course, improve. That should allow the Panthers to run the ball more next season, you would hope. But we will see about how all that plays out. So looking at all of this, has Dave Tepper finally got it right at head coach? I think so. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting right now. New customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and a variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has got you covered. And looking at Championship Sunday coming up here, the lines have not moved. The Eagles still 6.5-point favorites at home in Philly against the Commanders. The Chiefs still slight 1.5-point favorites at home against the Buffalo Bills. Can Buffalo finally get over the top? And can you imagine if Buffalo and Washington, 2 teams, well, at least Washington used to be the city of Charlotte's team. Of course, the Panthers have been that for the last 30 seasons. And then there's too many people here from Buffalo. So maybe an old school, in a way, Charlotte matchup, but that's what the Super Bowl is. I would hate to see Buffalo there, but we'll find out what happens, of course, on Sunday. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Has David Tepper finally found the right head coach here in Carolina? Go back to when he bought the team. Ron Rivera was still the head coach. In the 2018 season, they started off 6-2. People were talking about Cam Newton winning an MVP once again. And then, well, things fell apart as the Panthers lost 8 straight games, right, to end the season there in 2018. He decided, and I thought this was the right decision for David Tepper, understanding new ownership in the building. Ron Rivera wasn't the coach that he had hired, so why did he need to keep Ron around? I thought it actually was a smart decision to keep Ron Rivera around following that 2018 season, even with the collapse, because we all know, now they didn't lose they lost 7 straight, then they finally won a game there at the end of the season in New Orleans, a game that Panther fans did not want to win. That was a game where Kyle Allen introduced himself to the Carolina Panthers fan base, and we talk more about him in 2019, of course, a ton about him in 2019, but I didn't hate the decision to keep Ron around. He had built really a winner there in Carolina as the head coach. He had established a culture, and Cam wasn't physically there, and the hope was that in off season, get some things figured out, that he'd come back in 2019, add some pieces like Gerald McCoy, Bruce Irvin to the defensive line, and that Carolina would be A-okay in 2019. Well, that was certainly not the case, as the Panthers got off to a 0-2 start. Cam was done after that Tampa game, and you knew he was not healthy when on the short yardage opportunities, he did not run the ball. It was Christian McCaffrey, couldn't get that first down there late in that game. 0-2, people are saying, oh, season's over. But then Kyle Allen comes in. Carolina goes out there, wins 4 straight games. People feeling good following the win in London. And then, well, they fall apart yet again, losing what ended up to be, oh my God, I forgot how bad it was. 9 of their last 10 games in that season back in 2019. Ron Rivera fired on a Tuesday, which is the day off for teams. So pretty disrespectful to have the guy come in there, start game planning on a Monday, speak to the media on a Monday, and then the next day to fire him. But fired him with 4 weeks left. Perry Fuel ended up being the interim, and the guy is notorious for benching Dante Jackson, which was just crazy. I know Dante didn't necessarily conduct himself in the best manner that season in terms of like that situation. But yeah, so then he brought in Matt Rule, the smock. He had done a wonderful job at Temple, wonderful job at Baylor. I know people saying you never won a conference championship. Those people who say that don't know a damn thing about the history of Temple or Baylor football. So don't ever listen to those fools, which I think is a lot of people in this fan base. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but come on, man. You have no clue how difficult it is to win at Temple. Look at what Bruce Arians did at Temple. Look what Matt Rule did at Temple. Look at everybody at Baylor outside of Art Briles, and we'll see what Matt Rule was able to turn around there to fix that whole situation. Now, obviously, Matt Rule was not the right guy in Carolina. Much better college coach. Has not done much at Nebraska just yet in his 2 seasons so far there in Lincoln, but he wasn't the right guy for Carolina. So Tepper got that one wrong. Frank Reich had success when he had a quarterback, like when he had Phillip Rivers, when he had Andrew Luck, things worked out. But then, the Wentz experiment, the Ryan experiment, Brissett, when Luck retired right before the season, it didn't work out for him. He gets fired in Indianapolis, and David decided he didn't want he didn't want Steve Wilkes, even though Steve had gone out there, gone 500, had him right there on the doorstep of winning the division and hosting a playoff game. He got it wrong then. And now it looks like with Dave Canales, who has certainly the bona fides, having worked with Geno, had worked with Baker, got both those guys paid and helped teams get to the playoffs. He is somebody who it looked rocky early on. Like, why are you benching Bryce? Isn't this the only reason you're here? No one else wanted to talk to you. But it appears that based off of how this team played, as far as effort-wise, how they were able to turn things around in the second half of the season, where that's really what you want to see when you look at some of these teams led by a rookie head coach. Like you look at New England, Gerard Mayo went 4-13. He was fired, of course. But that New England team, they didn't look good. Brian Callahan, Tennessee went 3-14. How he has a job is beyond me. But they have the number 1 overall pick. Probably not going to work out there for Brian Callahan. Antonio Pierce, Mark Davis tried it. He didn't hire Bisaccia a couple years ago after he was the interim when they fired Gruden, and he helped them get to the playoffs. And he decided he was not going to do that again. He brought Antonio Pierce in to be the head coach after he was already the interim. And he went 4-13. They fired him. Now the Raiders did get better down the stretch, but that also cost him the opportunity to probably get a quarterback in what's not even a great quarterback draft anyways. And then Mike McDonald up there in Seattle went 10-7, missed the playoffs, unfortunately, for the Seahawks. So really, when you look at it, Canales was the best outside of McDonald. And you could argue, looking at the situation that McDonald inherited and one that Dave Canales inherited here in Carolina, that Dave did a better job. So when you look at the fact that this team got better, there's other guys who are in the same situation who teams look just awful. It looks like David Tepper finally got the head coaching hire right. You look at the hallway promotion of Dan Morgan, and you kind of scratch your heads like, is this the right thing to do? Even though Morgan has been on a list of names of guys that would make sense to be a general manager down the road. Eventually, he's probably going to get that opportunity. So why not let it be here? Back in Charlotte, where he had been a player before. Now, necessarily, that should not factor into things, but still, why not? And then with Dave Canales, Dan and him had that connection. He had, of course, the bona fides of the quarterback coaching and all that. And we've seen how it's worked out, where they finished off the season going 4-5, and they went 5-12 overall, and clean up a couple things, add some couple of players this offseason, and no reason why this team, potentially on paper, could be like a 7-8 win team in 2025. I know that's not necessarily what you want. It's still going to take some time. Like, this defense is not going to completely turn, is not going to change completely overnight. It's unfortunately going to take probably 2 off seasons to get them to where they need to be. And you probably think too, with the Jero Vero coming back, that is going to stunt any growth. We'll see what ends up happening. But yeah, Dave Canales, to me, got a couple things right that I really liked. Got some things wrong that I didn't necessarily like. But overall, like, this is a guy that Carolina should be happy to have. And it looks like this is the right hire for this team. And we'll see how things continue to develop, as David Tepper appears to have not gotten this one wrong just yet. All right. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all, subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where I'll be back on Friday, which is tomorrow, answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding. And I'll talk to y'all on Friday.